I didn't notice the exact moment my life started slipping away from me. There was no dramatic event. No explosion. No single decision I could point to and say, that was it. It happened quietly. So quietly that for a long time I thought everything was fine. If you had asked me back then how I was doing, I would have answered without hesitation, I'm okay. Not happy. Not fulfilled. Just okay. And that word became the most dangerous lie I ever told. I learned early how to endure. How to adapt. How to stay. When something felt wrong, I told myself it would pass. When something hurt, I convinced myself it wasn't that serious. When I felt empty, I blamed fatigue, stress, the season, anything but the truth. I stayed because staying felt responsible. Because leaving felt selfish. Because people praised me for being patient, loyal, reliable. They didn't see the cost. Every day looked the same. Wake up. Prepare myself to be functional. Play my role convincingly enough that no one would ask questions. I smiled at the right moments. Nodded at the right words. Answered messages just fast enough to seem present. Inside, I was slowly disconnecting. The strange thing about losing yourself is that it doesn't hurt at first. It feels like relief. You stop wanting. You stop expecting. You stop imagining anything different. And when you stop imagining, you stop suffering, temporarily. I didn't realize how much I had given up until someone asked me a simple question, what do you want next? I remember standing there, frozen, my mind completely blank. Not because I didn't want to answer. Because I genuinely didn't know. That scared me more than I was willing to admit. I started noticing signs I had ignored for years. How every plan felt heavy before it even began. How weekends no longer refreshed me, they only reminded me that nothing was changing. How I felt more alive imagining escape than living my actual days. But I told myself this was adulthood. That dreams were for younger people. That stability mattered more than meaning. So I stayed. I stayed in conversations that drained me. I stayed in situations that shrank me. I stayed because leaving would require admitting that endurance had failed me. People around me assumed I was strong. Reliable. Grounded. They didn't see how often I fantasized about disappearing, not dying, just, not being reachable. No phone calls. No explanations. No obligations. Just silence. I didn't want a new life. I wanted relief. That's how I know now that I was already breaking. There was a moment, small, ordinary, that exposed everything. I was sitting alone one evening, staring at nothing, when I realized I couldn't remember the last time I felt genuinely excited about anything. Not anxious excitement. Not nervous anticipation. Real excitement. The kind that makes you forget to check the time. That realization hit me harder than any crisis could have. Because it meant I hadn't just lost joy, I had lost direction. I had been living on pause, telling myself I was being careful, when in reality I was avoiding responsibility for my own life. Responsibility isn't just about paying bills or keeping promises. It's about choosing. And I hadn't chosen anything in years. I let life happen to me because it felt safer than deciding and being wrong. But being passive didn't protect me. It slowly erased me. I began to understand something uncomfortable. I wasn't trapped. I was settled. And settling had become my excuse. The longer I stayed, the harder it became to imagine leaving. Not because I loved where I was, but because I had forgotten who I could be. That's when the thought first appeared, quietly, almost gently, what if staying is the real mistake? That question followed me everywhere. In the mornings. At night. In the middle of conversations I barely listened to. And once that question takes root, it doesn't let go. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. I had stayed too long. And the price of staying was becoming someone I no longer recognized. Once the thought took hold, it didn't leave me alone. What if staying is the real mistake? It echoed in my head during the most ordinary moments. While brushing my teeth. While answering messages I didn't care about. While nodding through conversations that felt like recycled air. I tried to silence it the way I had silenced everything else. I told myself I was being dramatic, ungrateful, that plenty of people would be happy with what I had. And maybe they would. But I wasn't them. The more I ignored that truth, the louder my body protested. Sleep stopped feeling restorative. I woke up tired, not physically, existentially. As if my mind had been working all night trying to escape a cage I refused to acknowledge. I became irritable over nothing. Then numb again. A cycle so quiet that no one noticed. I kept functioning. That was the problem. Functioning gave everyone the illusion that I was fine, including myself. There was a particular kind of loneliness that settled in. Not the loneliness of being alone. The loneliness of being unseen while surrounded by people. I could be in a room full of familiar faces and feel like a stranger observing a life that wasn't mine. Sometimes I imagined standing up and telling the truth. Saying, I'm not okay. I don't know why I'm here. I feel like I've been holding my breath for years. But honesty felt dangerous. Because once spoken, it demands action. And I wasn't sure I was brave enough to act. So instead, I minimized myself. I spoke less. Wanted less. Expected less. I became easier to accommodate. And every time I did, something inside me retreated a little further. People confuse stability with health. They're not the same. Stability can exist in a life that's slowly suffocating. I started noticing how often I used the word later. Later I'll change things. Later I'll rest. Later I'll live differently. Later became a placeholder for courage I didn't have yet. But later never comes on its own. One evening, something inside me finally cracked, not loudly, but decisively. I was looking at my own reflection, and I felt a strange detachment. As if I were studying someone who had made a series of compromises and was now living with the consequences. I didn't hate that person. I pitied them. And that was worse. Pity means you've stopped believing in rescue. That night, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years: if nothing changes, can you live like this for the rest of your life? I tried to imagine it. 10 more years of endurance. Of muted emotions. Of quiet resignation disguised as maturity. My chest tightened. The answer was immediate. No. But knowing what you can't live with doesn't automatically tell you what to do next. That's the cruel part. Leaving meant uncertainty. Discomfort. Disappointment, not just for others, but for the version of me that believed loyalty meant self-sacrifice. Staying meant safety. Predictability. And a slow internal death I was already familiar with. It wasn't a dramatic choice between good and evil. It was a moral dilemma between pain now and pain later. I realized something unsettling: I had been choosing pain later for years because it felt less confrontational. Because it allowed me to remain agreeable. Because it spared others from discomfort. At my own expense. I began to see how often I prioritized being understandable over being honest. How often I explained away my silence as patience. How often I mistook self-erasure for kindness. That realization was not empowering. It was humiliating. Because it meant I had participated willingly. No one had forced me to stay. No one had trapped me. I had stayed because it was easier than admitting I wanted more. That truth burned. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The weight of all the unmade decisions pressed down on me. Not just the big ones, the daily ones. The conversations I avoided. The boundaries I never set. The moments I swallowed my truth to keep the peace. Peace built on silence is fragile. Eventually, it collapses inward. I started preparing mentally for change, not action yet, just possibility. I imagined what leaving would cost me. Who would be confused? Who would be hurt? Who would think I was selfish, unstable, ungrateful? Then I imagined staying. And for the first time, that future scared me more. That's when I understood something crucial: fear isn't always a warning. Sometimes it's a compass. I wasn't afraid of leaving because it was wrong. I was afraid because it required me to finally choose myself. And once you do that, there's no pretending you didn't know better. That night, I didn't make a plan. I made a decision. Not to leave immediately. Not to disappear. But to stop lying to myself. And that decision changed everything. Because once you stop lying internally, the external life you're living becomes impossible to maintain. Cracks begin to show. And something has to give. The moment I stopped lying to myself, my life became unbearably loud. Not on the outside, nothing changed there at first. The same places. The same routines. The same people who assumed I was exactly who I had always been. But inside, the silence I had relied on for years was gone. Every compromise started to itch. Every "it's fine" tasted bitter. Every day felt heavier because I was now aware of what I was carrying. Awareness doesn't free you immediately. It traps you first. Because once you see the truth, continuing to live against it feels like a betrayal you can't unfeel. I began noticing how much energy it took just to maintain the image of stability. How many small performances filled my days. How often I smiled to reassure others while something inside me recoiled. I realized that I had mistaken consistency for integrity. Integrity requires alignment. Consistency only requires repetition. I had been repeating a life I no longer believed in. The guilt intensified. Not just guilt toward others, but guilt toward myself. For every year I postponed honesty. For every instinct I ignored. For every time I chose to be understandable instead of real. There were nights I lay awake, negotiating with myself like a desperate mediator. Maybe you don't need to leave completely. Maybe you can adjust things slowly. Maybe this discomfort will fade again. But I knew that voice. It was the same one that had kept me stuck for years. Comfort doesn't argue loudly. It whispers. The breaking point didn't come as a dramatic collapse. It came as clarity. I was standing in the middle of an ordinary day when it hit me: if I stayed, nothing catastrophic would happen. And that was the problem. No explosion. No visible tragedy. Just decades more of quiet resignation. That future felt unbearable in a way panic never had. Because panic ends. Resignation settles. I understood then that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a refusal to continue. I didn't leave immediately. I started with smaller, terrifying acts. I said no without explaining. I spoke truths that made rooms uncomfortable. I stopped cushioning my words to protect everyone else's peace. Some people reacted with confusion. Others with disappointment. A few with anger. And something surprising happened. I survived it. The world didn't collapse. I wasn't punished for being honest. I wasn't abandoned the way I had feared. What I lost were illusions. Illusions of harmony. Illusions of acceptance built on self-silencing. The final decision came quietly. One morning, I woke up and realized that staying now felt like active self-harm. Not dramatic. Not visible. But deliberate. So I chose differently. Leaving didn't feel triumphant. It felt solemn. Like closing a door not because you hate what's behind it, but because you can't live there anymore. I didn't announce it. I didn't seek permission. I didn't try to be understood by everyone. I chose myself without asking for applause. And that choice came with consequences. There were moments of doubt. Loneliness. Fear that I had misread everything. But there was also something I hadn't felt in years: alignment. My days weren't suddenly joyful. But they were honest. I wasn't chasing happiness. I was practicing presence. And presence changes everything. I stopped measuring my life by how reasonable it looked from the outside. I started measuring it by how little I had to numb myself to get through it. The regret didn't disappear. I still mourn the years I stayed too long. The versions of myself that never fully existed. The chances I missed because I chose safety over truth. But regret no longer controls me. It informs me. It reminds me what happens when I confuse endurance with virtue. If you're listening to this and you feel that quiet suffocation, the one that doesn't scream but slowly convinces you to shrink, hear this: you don't need a breakdown to justify change. You don't need permission to choose differently. And you don't need to disappear to reclaim yourself. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop staying. I stayed too long. And leaving wasn't my failure. Staying would have been. This is the life I'm building now, not louder, not perfect, but mine. And for the first time, that's enough.